A new Gallup poll asked voters if a third major political party was needed for Americans to feel adequately represented. That poll found in January 2021, 70% of independents felt the need for a third party compared to 46% of Democrats and a rather high 63% of Republicans.
Really interesting. Editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of the Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and co-host of the Real Line podcast, Marshall Kossoff. They join us now to discuss. Marshall, we've talked a lot about third parties, I think, over the last several months. The large increase in Republican voters, probably a response to Trump, but you actually see pretty sustainable and large increases in almost every single one of those coalitions. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, the part that's just interesting with the Republicans is it could come from two different directions. So one, you could have, once again, it's not a huge part of the party, but it's a real part of it, the Liz Cheney Republicans, who were much more comfortable in the party of George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, and are definitely, especially after the vote, are going to feel like they don't have a home right now in the party. And then you are also going to have Trump Republicans who just aren't going to like anything the DC establishment is really supporting there. So it can come from two different directions. And the real question for the party is are you going to be able to move on from those fights in that specific era that's defining that?
Yeah, because that's where you see the big spike. If we can just throw those that graph back on the screen so people can see, where you see the really clear spike is among Republicans. I mean, like basically instantly, once Trump is out of office, it shoots up from, it looks like 40% all the way up to 63% almost instantaneously. So Max, what do you think is going on there?
I mean, it's hard to kind of parse whether or not this is like something real or whether Republicans are just kind of going through the cycles that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party goes through, like every now and then, right? Whichever party's out of power, right, has a dissenting faction that is increasingly pissed by the kind of side that is dominating the party and is in a position to kind of entertain the possibility of the third party. But what I really take away from this report, right, are kind of like three big kind of points that were made in there. Like one, there are a lot of people, both on the right and the left, who like the idea of having a third party, right? But as this report points out, there's really no kind of consensus on what the sort of ideological makeup of that party should be, right? So in a way, there are a lot of different people who want a third party, but there is not a consensus of people who want this third party, right? That kind of makes like ideological sense. Also, the reforms that would make a third party possible are not very popular, or at least as this report suggests, politicians have not done a good job of linking that cause to this sort of they have not linked the kind of legislative process that would be necessary to make this happen to this kind of latent desire for a third party itself. And then third is that one of the kind of points tucked away in one of the paragraphs is that the threat of the opposing mainstream party will more or less always trump people's kind of desire for a third party. And so I guess I would caution from someone who's been through it on the Democratic side, I would caution Republicans saying, like, this will most likely end up with everyone kind of falling in line when the specter of the Democratic threat in the next two elections really takes hold.
That's it right there.
No question whatsoever. I did see, Crystal found this, Marshall, from Matt Iglesias. Quote, the opportunity for a third party would be to replace Democrats as the opposition to the GOP in states like Wyoming, where the Dems are now totally uncompetitive. You could imagine Cheney, Lisa Murkowski, Joe Manchin in such a party. I think the same thing might apply to Republicans in California. What do you make of it from that perspective?
Yeah, so the part that doesn't make as much sense to me here is politics is national right now. So I just don't really see in those areas how the third party is going to be the avenue for that. The more logical thing that you're going to have happen is those folks are just going to switch to the opposite party. So like for Joe Manchin, he entirely makes sense as a Democrat. He's got a good role. He has power within the party there. If he were to switch to some amorphous third thing, that wouldn't really make as much sense there. But yeah, the California example is also a really good one because you are seeing a problem where you've got the out of power party. But I think the way that is really just going to work is you are in these one party states going to have fights within the party. So you are going to see a fight within the Democratic Party. Like, so, you know, you've talked about Caitlyn Jenner, but Caitlyn Jenner is such a Republican that obviously she was going to run as a Republican. But moving forward, if I were a celebrity who was dissatisfied with the status quo in California, you should run in the Democratic primary. And that's how those fights are going to work out so long as we're stuck in this very specific moment where everything is going to be decided based on how the fights are playing out in D.C.
Yeah.
It is interesting to me, Max, that it is such a high percentage of the Republican Party that says they feel that there should be a third party. And it seems kind of dissonant to me with some of the other data that we have that says Trump still has kind of a lock on the Republican Party as it exists today, and Trump is still extremely popular, although he's seen some erosion with the Republican base, but not very much. So to me, those two pieces of data don't really fit together. How are you both dissatisfied with this current iteration of the Republican Party, but also extremely satisfied with Donald Trump?
So, I mean, I guess the thing that the caveat that I would give, kind of going back to what I was just saying, right, is that you are just in general in a different kind of ideological and political position when you're out of power as a party, right? And you have more ability to kind of think about these things, at least in the abstract. The real question, as we kind of seem to be talking about, is like, what material form, if any, will this actually take? And I guess, like, you know, to return to something that we've talked about a number of times on this show, right? I think that in a lot of ways, one of the underlying kind of takeaways from this report that I was looking at, both like trying to synthesize what's going on the left and the right side, right, is that in many ways this is kind of the situation that you end up with when people are largely fed up with the kind of general system by which we have been conditioned to believe that the only way to kind of solve our problems is to elect a small body of people to fix them for us, right? And because let's not forget that, you know, like by and large, you know, America has always had the problem of the mass non-voting class, right? Even in 2020, where we had historic general election turnout, 80 million eligible voters did not show up, right? I mean, like, the story of American democracy in many ways is the story of the people who can't or don't vote more than the people who do vote, right? And I think that one kind of piece that's missing from this kind of discussion, right, is how this drive for a third party would look if it was something that had kind of more tangible reach into kind of the democratic engagement of working people's lives. Like, look at unions as an example, right? Unions are not parties, but they are ostensibly a democratic kind of institution by which working people elect representatives, negotiate, vote, so on and so forth, right? And the workplace where a lot of these workers are represented is where you have more ideological mix than in most other parts of this country. You have right-leaning people, you have left-leaning co-workers, right? And they have to figure out a way within their union to figure out what they have in common, how they're going to achieve their goals, and how to kind of set their differences aside to achieve those things, right? That is a sort of model that, by and large, people do not have a kind of consciousness of in our political system. Politics does not just happen in DC, it happens every day in the workplace, in our communities. And so if we linked that to the question of what a third party could be, a third party that wasn't just kind of what sort of like political issues can draw a through line between these different ideological camps, but rather what kind of material, substantive issues that people face in their daily lives can bring people together across ideological barriers. What would a third party that does that actually look like? And I think it should be a class-based party, obviously.
Wow.
That is
well
actually
said.
very
It's a
profound
great monologue.
line of thinking. Guys, stick with us. More Team Rising with you right after this.